Every criminal case generates two stories: the story the evidence actually supports and the story that gets told. I'm Melissa Diedrich, and this is Mind Motive Media. This episode, I want to bring the focus back to the U.S. and look into a pretty well-known case from the late 1990s, which has some parallels with the Perugia case, but also quite a few facts not so well known, and of course, things that were not explored. So let's go back in time to July 8, 1997, Norfolk, Virginia, when 19-year-old Navy sailor Bill Bosko came home after a week at sea and found his wife of 3 months dead in their apartment. She'd been the victim of a brutal sexual assault, stabbed multiple times and strangled. Her name was Michelle Moore-Bosko, and she was just 18. The story the media told everyone was the police focusing on the neighbors, specifically a man across the hall named Daniel Williams, who knew Bill. Detective Robert Ford brought in Williams, and hours later, Williams confessed. That confession led to Joseph Dick Jr., who also confessed, and then started naming more people. Derek Tice, Eric Wilson, all were brought in, all confessed. 4 sailors, 4 confessions, and the case seemed airtight. All 4 were convicted between 1999 and 2000, with Derek Tice's retrial coming in 2003. They all received sentences ranging from 8.5 years to life. In 2009, though, 3 got conditional pardons. They were released from prison, but still were on the sex offender registry. And then in 2017, all 4 got absolute pardons from Governor McAuliffe, the then governor of Virginia, 20 years after the crime. And here's the word that's important: pardons, not exonerations. We'll come back to why that difference is everything. And in a nutshell, that's the official story, which on the surface looked airtight: 4 confessions, 4 convictions. But that summary skipped over what information investigators actually had in their hands while this was happening in real time. So I want to take a few minutes and walk through the actual facts that were available but not publicized. And it started prior to the murder of Michelle Moore-Bosko by about a week. A man named Omar Ballard beat Melissa Morse with a baseball bat. And Ballard's friend Tamika Taylor brought him to the Bosko's apartment to shelter him from the angry mob. Taylor was friends with the Boskos, primarily Michelle. So Bill Bosko briefly sheltered Ballard. A week later, when police arrived on the scene of Michelle Moore-Bosko's murder, Detective Maureen Evans started questioning neighbors. She was the first on the scene. She was the one in charge at that time. One of the people that she questioned was Tamika Taylor. Well, Taylor told Detective Evans that a neighbor of the Boskos, Daniel Williams, was obsessed with Michelle. She also told Detective Evans that maybe she should look at Omar Ballard. But Detective Evans focused on Williams because he seemed odd, and she brought him in for questioning. While in for questioning, which turned out to be an interrogation, Williams was given a polygraph and passed. But Detective Evans told him he failed. After 8 hours, Evans wasn't getting the confession she expected from him, so Detective Robert Ford was brought into the room. Within an hour, Ford got the confession, but no part of the questioning or interrogation was recorded. Williams remained in custody. But on December 11 of 1997, police learned that Williams' DNA didn't match anything at the crime scene. And they didn't tell his own attorney for another 4 months. They also didn't stop their investigation into Williams. No, they widened it. Then in January 1998, prosecutors offered Williams a plea deal. Plead guilty for a life sentence versus continuing to maintain your innocence and risk the death penalty. But he refused. And then around the same time, Omar Ballard, who was by this time in custody for a rape and beating of a 14-year-old girl that occurred a week after Michelle's murder, he pled guilty to that crime. Then, police decide to arrest Williams' roommate and shipmate, Joseph Dick. Well, Dick maintained his innocence for hours, saying he was on duty aboard the USS Saipan that night, but nobody checked the ship's logs. Ford got him to confess. 11 weeks after that arrest, Dick's DNA was also excluded, but he also was not released. Ford takes it a step further and has a jailhouse informant suggest to Dick that he name a co-conspirator. So he named Eric Wilson. But Wilson's DNA also was excluded. So Ford goes back to Dick again and gets him to name a fourth man, Derek Tice, who he identified from a Navy photograph. Tice was arrested in Florida, brought back to Norfolk, and interrogated for 11 hours, after which, you guessed it, Ford got another confession. And he got two more named sailors, Richard Pauly and Jeffrey Ferris. Ford also got Tice to describe a group break-in, which was contrary to any evidence from the crime scene. The apartment showed no sign of forced entry and no sign of a large struggle. It was a small apartment and it was neat and tidy. So Tice was describing a crime scene that didn't exist. And not surprisingly, Tice's DNA was excluded within weeks. But he's still being held, and later, under another round of questioning, he named a seventh man, John Dancer, who was 300 miles away in Pennsylvania at the time of the crime, with paper records to prove it. Dancer was indicted anyway. Now we're in 1999, and Daniel Williams and Joseph Dick have both pled guilty to rape and capital murder in exchange for life sentences. About a month after that happened, Omar Ballard sent a letter to a woman he knew claiming he killed Michelle Moore-Bosko. And around that time, a refined DNA test excluded all 7 men under indictment for Michelle Moore-Bosko's murder. Not inconclusive, excluded every single one of them. That's the moment this case should have collapsed. But instead, Ford and the prosecution carried on with their group attack theory. A month later, police investigated Ballard based on his letter. His DNA was confirmed as the only one to match the evidence from the crime scene. He was arrested, but as the 8th and final suspect. He confessed twice more that month, and his account was the only account to match the physical and forensic evidence. That one detail should have unraveled everything. But the prosecution's response? No, he's protecting the others. It was a group crime. So the prosecution just folded him into the group theory as the 8th man, rather than ask why the one forensically consistent confession contradicted the other 4. None of the 4 who confessed had criminal records. All were trained to respect and obey authority and cooperate with authority. And all had vulnerabilities that detectives and prosecutors should have questioned with their confessions. But instead, the one forensically consistent sole perpetrator confession was set aside, and 4 contradictory, forensically unsupported confessions held up in court. Clear cases of tunnel vision and confirmation bias. So now we have 7 men who have been excluded by DNA but are still in jail. We have 1 match and 1 internally consistent account. But the case against the sailors went to trial anyway. And we have a theory of a crime that's holding everything together, despite the evidence pointing in a different direction. But if the evidence wasn't holding this together, what was? We could ask, why would an innocent person confess? But given some of the things we know about the facts in this case, I think the better question is, under what conditions would almost anyone confess? Because those conditions are real, they're buildable, and they were built here. This is not going to be a retelling of PBS Frontline's 2010 documentary, The Confessions, which, in my opinion, is the best existing treatment of this case. It has real interviews with all 4 of the sailors and real depth. Rather than retell what's already been told well, I want to cover what that documentary did not, specifically the mechanics of how contamination became courtroom corroboration, the psychological profile behind Joseph Dick's confession, and the fact that investigators used each confession as leverage on the next suspect. A mechanism that's actually separate from contamination itself, yet almost nobody names it as its own thing. So the mechanics. What does this do to a brain? Under sustained stress, the part of the brain responsible for future consequence thinking degrades. It stops calculating, if I confess now, I'll be convicted later. And it starts calculating, how do I survive the next 10 minutes? Sleep deprivation accelerates this. Research shows that 18 to 24 hours without sleep produces cognitive impairment similar to moderate alcohol intoxication. These are not weak people. Their cognitive architecture was systematically dismantled. And then add the polygraph deception, because Ford had told each man the machine had already confirmed their guilt, even though it did not. They had all passed. Police are legally allowed to lie in interrogations. But false polygraph feedback reliably increases false confession rates in controlled studies. The machine told these men their denial was pointless. And then there's the contamination problem, the thing that rarely gets explained. Because Ford showed suspects crime scene photos during the investigation. I don't know if anyone has seen actual crime scene photos, but once you've seen those images, you cannot unsee them. And any description you give will incorporate those details, not because you were there, but because you saw them. So Ford fed suspects his theory of the crime, and then those details, as well as details from the crime scene photographs, ended up in their accounts as confessions, which were then presented to the courts as inside knowledge. But each confession was also built on the previous one. Joseph Dick's confession was used as evidence against Tice. It was circular, manufactured corroboration. Richard Leo calls this the contamination to corroboration pipeline. The interrogator's knowledge becomes the suspect's apparent knowledge. But because nothing was recorded, no one could trace where the information actually came from. The memory source contamination, the facts that were fed to suspects during interrogations and supported by visuals of the crime scene photos, made all the confessions sound credible during trial. Facts were accurate, but the way those facts were obtained was never revealed or explained scientifically. A second mechanism, distinct from contamination, is cascading social proof. Here's the part that's easy to merge with contamination, but it's actually a different phenomenon. Contamination corrupts what a suspect says. It puts wrong facts into his account. Cascading social proof is about whether a suspect even resists at all. And in this case, once Ford had Joseph Dick's statement, he didn't just borrow facts from it for the next interrogation. He used the statement itself as social pressure. Your friend already told us you were there. That's the line that breaks people. It's not evidence. It's peer pressure with a badge. And think about it. You're in your early 20s. You've been trained to obey and respect authority and cooperate with them. You're serving your country in the Navy, and now you're stuck in this little room for hours with only soda and cigarettes in your belly. You're not allowed to talk to your family. You don't even know that you need to ask for an attorney because you think innocent people don't need attorneys. And you've got this large man with a badge and backup in your face, yelling at you, screaming that you committed a crime that you know you didn't, convincing you that you failed the polygraph test, screaming that you're lying to him, and threatening that if you keep lying, you're going to get the death penalty. You're tired, you're hungry, you're isolated. You're also young, naive, and confused, and you just want to get the heck out of that room and go home. What a nightmare. So you've got two mechanisms running at once. The one that explains why the confessions ended up with the same wrong details in them, and the other explaining why four separate young men under sequential pressure all eventually broke. Now, it's worth holding those apart in your head because they call for different fixes. Recording solves contamination, but it doesn't by itself solve the cascading pressure between suspects. There's also psychology behind the confessions. 3 types based on psychologist Saul Kassin and his colleague Lawrence Wrightsman's framework: voluntary, coerced compliant, and coerced internalized. The voluntary is pretty self-explanatory. No external pressure was applied, and you just gave a statement. Coerced compliant is when a suspect knows they're innocent, but they confess to escape an intolerable situation. This applied to all 4 sailors. They knew they were innocent. They confessed to end the ordeal, to escape the death penalty threat, and to get out of that room. They mistakenly believed the truth would come out later. It was a rational decision that they made in an irrational situation. And then the third is coerced internalized. And it's when a suspect actually starts to believe that they may be guilty because of the interrogation pressure. And this one applied to Joseph Dick. He seriously questioned whether he committed the crime, even when he wasn't there. It might not sound plausible, but after enough hours of being told your memory's wrong and you were there, being shown crime scene photos, being threatened with the death penalty, some people just lose trust in their own recollection. And Joseph Dick didn't just confess. He started naming other sailors who were never near the scene. He was generating new suspects on demand. That's not somebody remembering a crime. That's somebody trying to give the interrogator what they want. The vulnerabilities of the men was also not dealt with. Daniel Williams' wife was dying from ovarian cancer. He had recently married her to ensure that she had health insurance. He was her full-time caretaker, and he was emotionally depleted before Michelle Moore-Bosko was killed and his nightmare began. He was only looked at because of a neighbor's tip about him being obsessed. A behavioral comment that created a target fixation and tunnel vision. Joseph Dick Jr. was believed to have limited cognitive capacity, according to his superiors. They also had no doubt he was on duty that night and that he was not capable of sneaking off the ship undetected. Eric Wilson was only named by Joseph Dick under interrogation pressure, and Derek Tice explicitly invoked his right to remain silent but was ignored. He also asked for a lawyer, and that was ignored. All 4 of those boys were in the confession machine because Ford called himself a confession specialist. His method was aggressive, in your face, and accusatorial from the get-go. He started with the premise that the suspect is guilty. He confronted them with that and used a combination of psychological pressure and minimization to extract confessions. And here's how he did it. His interrogations were marathons, at least 8 hours or more, without breaks. He deceived suspects about evidence. He told them they failed polygraphs when they did not. He implied that there was forensic evidence against them when it did not exist. He used the death penalty as a lever by telling them they'd face death if they didn't cooperate. He also told them that their confessions would lead to more lenient treatment, even though courts are not bound by that. And the key is that he didn't record the actual interrogations. He only recorded the short confession statements at the end of the interrogations. That was not accidental, nor was it incidental. This is where forensic psychology can be helpful and useful in a legal proceeding. But in this case, the expert who tried to say all of this, Dr. Richard Offshee, out of Berkeley, California, and one of the foremost false confession researchers in the world, was blocked from testifying. So the jury convicted without ever hearing a scientific framework to evaluate what those confessions actually were. So now we've got the psychology aspect of it, the coercion, the contamination, cascading pressure, and cognitive collapse. But that's not what the public saw, because the coverage of this case told a very specific story using a very familiar template. And once you see the template, you can't really unsee it. Because when the media covers a crime, especially a violent one, it almost always organizes around 4 elements: victim, villain, motive, resolution. Not because journalists are lazy, but because that's the story shape that audiences recognize, and it's the shape that feels satisfying. The problem is that when that story is wrong, the template locks in the wrong answer. And in this case, the Norfolk Four case, every piece of that template was applied incorrectly and sometimes twice as the story shifted over the years. The victim in 1997, and correctly, was Michelle Moore-Bosko. But she got maybe 2 sentences of biography, young wife, newly married, and then she became the occasion for a story about other people. When the wrongful conviction narrative took over, the sailors became the victims, which was also true. But now Michelle moved completely off screen. The framework left no room for both truths at once. Michelle Moore-Bosko as a victim of a brutal murder, and 4 men as victims of a brutal system. The villain between 1997 and 2001 was the sailors. They were confessed killers, so the coverage didn't even need to be editorialized. The confessions did the work. Then, after Frontline's documentary and the wrongful conviction advocacy push, the villain shifted to Detective Ford, which is more accurate. But even then, Ford was framed as a rogue bad actor, a corrupt cop. And we know that there's more to that, and we'll talk about that later. The motive in the early coverage was group violence by young military men. The cast of characters practically implied the motive. It fit a cultural script, and it went unexamined. Then later, the motive assigned to Ford was corruption, extortion, and greed, which is true, but it missed the more interesting and troubling motive, institutional ambition. Ford wasn't just corrupt. He ran interrogations designed to produce confessions, regardless of guilt. Closed cases are how detectives build careers. So the incentive structure played a part in creating Ford. And that story is harder to tell than Rogue Cop. The resolution was never really correct, because at first the 4 sailors who confessed and were convicted was the resolution. But then after the PBS documentary, the resolution was revised to Norfolk Four pardoned after 20 years, a headline implying that the arc was complete. But it wasn't, because a pardon is not an exoneration. And I'll talk about that in a bit also. So the template gave us a story that felt complete, and most people who followed the case walked away thinking it was resolved. But it was not. And here's what was missed. The first miss was the expert testimony that was blocked, because Dr. Offshee reviewed these cases and concluded that 4 innocent men had been convicted based on false confessions produced by documented psychological coercion. He was hired by the defense. He was ready to testify. He had the analysis, he had the science, but he was blocked by Judge Poston from testifying. And here's why this is important. Research by Kassin shows that juries treat confession evidence as the queen of proofs. So even when instructed to weigh it critically, confessions dominate verdicts. Without a scientific framework for evaluating how a confession was produced, a jury has no way to distinguish a genuine admission from a psychologically coerced or manufactured one. So the jury had 4 confessions and no tools. Of course they convicted. Fortunately, courts beyond 2000 have become more receptive to false confession expertise. Not uniformly, but meaningfully. And that shift is partly because of cases like this one. The second miss that I mentioned earlier was that a pardon is not an exoneration. The 2009 conditional pardons released 3 men, but they were required to stay on the sex offender registry, meaning they had restricted housing, restricted employment, and restricted movement. The absolute pardons were stronger and provided a legal basis for expungement, but a basis for expungement is not actual expungement. They were pardoned, not exonerated. A pardon is a forgiveness of punishment. It doesn't vacate a conviction, it doesn't declare innocence, and it doesn't remove the record, which is what an exoneration would do. So even after the men were pardoned, some of them still had to register as sex offenders after the pardons, and that fight got almost no coverage. Eric Wilson, who served his sentence before the pardons, couldn't even access habeas corpus to challenge his conviction because the court said he was no longer in custody. A federal judge dissented, writing that he was deeply troubled that someone with compelling evidence of innocence had no forum to clear his name. So the label persists in ways the coverage never tracked. The media found its resolution in the pardons because the format demanded one, but the actual resolution, accountability, record clearing, systemic reform, never quite arrived. And then miss number 4 was what Ford actually did to get there, his pattern and what it says about the system. Because Ford was not in the room for Williams' first 8 hours. Detective Maureen Evans was. But Ford was the one that got the confession out of him, and from there, he's the constant. He ran every interrogation that follows. Dick, Wilson, Tice, pushing the same multiple offender theory through each one. None of the interrogations were recorded, not one. It's Ford's word for what was said in that room every time. Each interrogation ran between 8 and 11 hours, nonstop and accusatorial from minute 1. Each man was isolated, no access to family, no meaningful access to counsel early on, and no contact with fellow sailors. Crime scene photographs sat on the table during questioning, and the threat, explicit and repeated, you will get the death penalty if you don't cooperate. Derek Tice described it later as, Ford kept leaning towards me, yelling at me, calling me a liar, telling me I was going to die. The Norfolk Four are just the famous case, but they're not the only case. A conviction integrity review of Ford's case history found a pattern. In addition to the Norfolk Four, there was Joseph Carter, who was wrongfully imprisoned for nearly 30 years. There was Gilbert Merritt and Kevin Knight, who were each wrongfully imprisoned for nearly 20 years. And there was a teenager named Arcian Hicks, who was interrogated by Ford at 16, he claims, without a parent present, and who beat him into a confession. So this is not a rogue incident for Ford, it's a career. And it survived because there were no recordings. And because institutions protect their own. Miss number 4 were Richard Pauly, Jeffrey Ferris, and John Dancer, who were named but never talked about. Richard Pauly had verifiable bank records placing him hundreds of miles away at the time of the murder. He was indicted anyway. Jeffrey Ferris, he asked for an attorney during interrogation. The interrogation stopped, and he did not confess, but he was indicted anyway. And John Dancer, who had retired from the Navy, was living in Pennsylvania and had 2 independent records verifying his location. The accusation that Derek Tice made against him was recanted in private to Detective Ford, but the prosecution did not disclose this to Dancer's attorney. All 3 eventually had their charges dismissed. They were fortunate because they either had unimpeachable alibis or invoked their rights. And the only real difference between Dancer and Joseph Dick was that Dancer was given access to a lawyer and had an alibi that could not be explained away. Another miss was the human cost on this that doesn't resolve, because research on exonerees is pretty consistent. PTSD, depression, and anxiety at rates that rival combat veterans. Loss of identity, profound mistrust of institutions, difficulty with ordinary life after years of extraordinary injustice. And these men were imprisoned as sex murderers. That carries a very specific danger in prison. So why does any of this matter, and why do I bring it up 20 plus years later? Well, because the conditions still exist. Electronic recording of interrogations is still not federally mandated. Many jurisdictions do not have a corroboration requirement. A confession alone can convict. Death penalty threats as an interrogation tool are still legally permitted, and the interrogation techniques of Ford or its variations are still pretty well used. Unfortunately, this Norfolk Four case is not a historical artifact. It's a demonstration of what the current system can permit. And forensic psychology is actually important in this context because confession validity analysis, systematically evaluating whether a confession is reliable, is a distinct forensic specialty. It has frameworks, psychometric tools, and a research base. So a forensic psychologist reviewing these confessions would have flagged no recording, interrogation duration, documented death penalty threat, mutual inconsistency between confessions, contradiction with physical evidence, Joseph Dick's intellectual vulnerability, the contamination markers, and the cascading social pressure between suspects. That analysis was available in 1999. It was just blocked from reaching the people who needed it. And that's the argument for expert testimony, not that forensic psychologists should decide cases. That forensic psychologists need to be in the room before juries evaluate confessions. So what this asks of all of us is that every time we consume a crime story, if it's a podcast, a documentary, news coverage, if there's a confession involved, we need to be asking, what were the conditions that produced the confession? How long was the interrogation? Was it recorded? Was anything threatened? Was anything promised? Those questions are not adversarial to justice. They are justice. The assumption that they confessed so they did it is a cognitive shortcut that the system exploits. And the media reinforces it. We need to stop accepting it uncritically. In closing, I want to bring it back to the people, starting with Daniel Williams, because he was only 25 in 1997. He was the first one interrogated. He had no criminal record, and he had recently married when he was arrested. The incredibly sad part is that his wife, Nicole, died of ovarian cancer on November 2 of 1997, and he was not permitted to talk to her or to attend her funeral. Joseph Dick Jr. was 21 in 1997. He was Williams' roommate and shipmate. He also had no criminal record. He had suffered a traumatic brain injury when he was 3, and an assessment of him in childhood determined that he very likely suffered brain damage. He may have spent years genuinely believing at some level that he was guilty, because an interrogator worked very hard to instill that belief. Correcting an internalized false belief about your own actions is not something a pardon fixes. Eric Wilson was 21 in 1997. He completed his 8.5-year sentence, yet because he did, the courts have repeatedly refused to hear his petitions for exoneration. The legal standard for habeas corpus is that the petitioner needs to be in custody. So he spent years legally barred from clearing his own name because he served his time for a crime he did not commit. Derek Tice was 27 in 1997. He asked for a lawyer but didn't get one. A circuit court later found this to be a constitutional violation. At both of his trials, Judge Poston refused his defense's request to call an expert on false confessions because the judge erroneously believed that juries can understand that confessions can be coerced. Research refutes this. And when a dozen of his jurors later filed affidavits saying they believed the men were innocent and supported clemency, it just proved the gap between what jurors know and what information they need to properly evaluate a confession, a suspect's guilt or innocence. And then Ferris, Pauley, and Dancer, the 3 additional men indicted for capital rape and murder. They were publicly charged before their cases were dismissed. They had their careers and reputations damaged and experienced the full weight of a wrongful prosecution before their cases were dropped. The media treated them as a footnote when it should have highlighted them as proof of how far a prosecution would go. And Ford, he was eventually convicted for federal extortion, though, in 2010. And for those charges, he was sentenced to 12.5 years. Because there's no criminal charge in the United States for obtaining a false confession from an innocent person. So not only was he not held accountable for obtaining false confessions, the system in which he operated permitted, protected, and ultimately pensioned what he did. He continued to collect his city pension while he was in prison, and he's still collecting. It's estimated that it's over $600,000 in taxpayer funds. That story, of course, barely got covered. In 2023, the UVA School of Law Project for Informed Reform began a comprehensive review of cases that Ford was involved in. They have 90 confirmed cases that he was involved in, and potentially over 180 that could involve him. The cases are still being audited, and a detective that routinely put innocent people in prison has still not been held accountable for his actions. What about the attorneys? Well, Williams and Dick's attorneys had each come off trials where their client faced the death penalty. Dick's attorney's client actually received the death penalty. Both attorneys admitted that those cases affected them emotionally, and they both admitted wanting to make sure that their current clients did not get a death sentence. And by the way, the prosecutors in these cases had no adverse effects on their careers for prosecuting innocent men on a made-up theory. Michelle Moore-Bosko was 18 years old and 3 months into a marriage when she was killed. Her father spent the rest of his life asking the world to let his daughter rest. He publicly said, "Let my poor baby rest." Yet her family had to spend the next 2 decades navigating a legal process that reopened their grief at every turn instead of giving them closure. Her parents both died before the pardons and believed the prosecution's group attack theory. That dimension of the story was almost never told. Bill Bosko, her husband, who found her body, he cooperated fully and watched 4 men convicted and eventually pardoned for his wife's murder. He was a wreck after the murder and could not stop seeing the scene in his head for years. Every innocent person in this story paid a price for the same failure. A system that valued confession over truth, a media that didn't ask why, and a legal system that didn't stop itself when it could have and should have. This Norfolk Four case gets described as a miscarriage of justice, and it is that. But it's also a case study in exactly what forensic psychology exists to prevent, and what it can do when it's allowed in the room. Because for a system that believes in Blackstone's ratio that, quote, it is better that 10 guilty people escape than that one innocent suffer, end quote, the jury should be entitled to all information available, especially in a capital case. There's so much more in this case that I could talk about, and I could probably talk for hours. But the best source, if you are interested in more details on this, is the book The Wrong Guys by Tom Wells and Richard A. Leo. It's an excellent source for more details, and it's really worth a close read. I put the details in the show notes. And that's a wrap on episode 3 of Mind Motive Media. Thanks again for joining me. And a big thank you to everyone who's listened to the first couple of episodes, who's given me feedback, and who's told your family and friends to listen. I really, really appreciate it. If this is the kind of analysis that you've been looking for in the true crime space, or if you just really liked what you heard, please follow the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And if you're willing to leave a review, it genuinely helps other people find this show, and I'd appreciate that too. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and X if you'd like to continue the conversation on this or prior episodes. Next time, we're going to take a little bit of a turn with a different kind of a case. I'll see you then.